There is a house I used to own on the eastern side of a small Ohio town, on a street where the maple trees grew so close to the road that in late October their leaves would blow directly onto the front porch without any wind needing to carry them far. It was a small house by most measurements. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a kitchen that faced the backyard where I had planted 2 tomato plants the spring I moved in and watched them actually grow. I remember thinking that was a kind of miracle. A person can plant something, water it, leave it alone mostly, and something living appears. That felt important to me then. I was 38 years old, recently divorced, and I had learned to find small miracles where I could. I had bought that house with money I'd saved over 11 years of careful, borderline obsessive budgeting. I drove a car that was 11 years old. I brought lunch to work every single day for 6 years. I did not take vacations that required airplane tickets. I had a specific notebook where I tracked every dollar I spent, not in an app, not on a spreadsheet, but in a physical notebook with a green cover that I kept in my nightstand drawer. My coworker Marcus used to tease me about it. He'd say, "Daniel, you know banks have online portals now, right?" And I would laugh and say, "I know, I just like to see it in my own handwriting." Which was true. Seeing the numbers in my own hand made them feel real in a way a screen never quite managed. The house cost $142,000. I put $30,000 down. By the time I was 38, I had paid it down to $91,000. The equity I held in that house was not just money. It was time. It was every Tuesday evening I spent at home instead of at a bar. It was every vacation I did not take, every coat I wore for an extra season because the one I had was still functional. That equity was a record of every small choice I had made toward something solid. I need you to understand that before I tell you anything else, because nothing that follows makes sense unless you understand what that house meant to me. It wasn't just property. It was the one thing in my adult life I had built entirely by myself. My family found out about the house in the spring of my 39th year. Not the existence of it, they had always known I owned a house, but the extent of what I had in it. The equity. The savings account I had alongside it. My mother mentioned to my sister Ellen that I had done well for myself, and I didn't realize until much later that this single, offhand comment sent a kind of ripple through the family that I couldn't see at the time. Ellen called me on a Thursday evening. I was eating dinner alone, a pasta dish I had made from a recipe I'd found in a magazine in a waiting room somewhere and photographed with my phone. Ellen's calls were infrequent. We weren't estranged exactly, but we weren't close in the way some siblings are. There were 4 years between us. She had married young, had 2 kids early, and her life had moved in a very different direction from mine. When she called, I assumed it was something routine. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was fine, eating dinner. She asked about work, about the house. The conversation felt a little formal, the way conversations feel when someone is building toward something and they haven't decided yet how to approach it. I noticed the formality. I set down my fork, but I didn't say anything about it. I just waited. What she eventually said was this: "Mom and Dad are struggling." I knew that. I had known it for about 2 years. My parents were in their mid-60s, both retired, living in the house they'd owned for 30 years in a suburb of Columbus. My father had a pension from 31 years at a paper manufacturing company, and my mother collected Social Security. Together, they had enough to cover their basic expenses, but not by much, and the margins were thin enough that any unexpected cost became a real problem. A car repair. A medical bill. A roof issue that had been deferred once, and then deferred again. "I know," I told Ellen. "We've been thinking," she said, using that plural that I would spend a long time turning over later, "that maybe you'd be in a position to help." The conversation that followed lasted about 40 minutes. Ellen explained that my parents' roof was failing. That was the immediate issue. But beyond the roof, there was the more fundamental problem that they were stretched too thin on a fixed income, and that the house itself, the family home, the house she and I had grown up in, was in a kind of slow decline. Deferred maintenance accumulating like interest. A furnace that was aging. Windows that let cold through. A bathroom that had needed remodeling since, as Ellen put it, basically forever. And then she said something that she said very carefully, very gently, the way you say a thing you have rehearsed. She said, ought maybe if you sold your place, you could help them get the house into shape. And maybe live there for a while, save some money, it would be good for everyone. I sat very still after she said that. Outside my kitchen window it was dark, and I could see the reflection of my kitchen in the glass, the overhead light, the counter, my own shape sitting at the table. I remember thinking that the reflection looked like someone else's kitchen, someone else's life. I told Ellen I would think about it. And I did think about it. For 3 weeks I thought about almost nothing else. Section 2. The weight of family logic. There is a particular kind of pressure that only family can create, and it works differently from any other kind of pressure because it arrives wrapped in love, or what sounds like love, what presents all of its credentials as love. My mother called me the following Sunday, which she did every Sunday, but this time the call was different in a way I could feel within the first few minutes. She asked about my health. She asked about my job. And then she said, "I heard you spoke to Ellen." "I did," I said. "We don't want you to feel pressured," she said immediately, which told me she had thought carefully about how to begin this conversation and had decided that preemptively addressing the pressure was the best strategy. That told me, too, that she was aware this was pressuring. People don't generally say, "I don't want you to feel pressured," unless they suspect they might be doing exactly that. We talked for 45 minutes. She told me about the roof. She described the way the rain had started coming through a corner of the guest room's ceiling, leaving a stain the color of weak tea. She mentioned the furnace technician who had come out in February and said the unit had maybe 2 more winters in it. She talked about my father's back, which had been bad for years, and how the steps to the basement where the laundry was had become difficult for him. She talked about these things in a tone that was not dramatic. She was not crying or pleading. She was just describing. And that matter-of-fact delivery was somehow more effective than dramatics would have been. It made everything she said feel undeniable, simply true, a plain accounting of real circumstances. Then she said, "You've always been the steady one, Daniel. You've always been the one who plans ahead." I knew what she meant. She meant it as a compliment. She also meant it as an explanation for why I was the one being asked, because I had been careful, because I had saved, because the fruit of all my planning was now visible and within reach. I didn't say yes that day, but I also didn't say no, and in family matters, maybe in all matters, not saying no is often how a yes eventually gets assembled. My brother Kevin called 2 days after my mother. Kevin was the youngest of the 3 of us, 34, and he lived in Columbus about 4 miles from my parents. He was louder than Ellen, more direct in the way younger siblings sometimes are, less careful with his framing. He said, "Look, I'd help more if I could, but Amy and I are basically underwater right now with the new place." He and his wife Amy had bought a house the previous fall, a larger house than they probably needed, in a neighborhood slightly nicer than what their income comfortably supported. I had heard things about that purchase secondhand through my mother and had formed opinions I kept to myself. "I get it," I told Kevin. "Ellen's situation is what it is," he said, meaning that Ellen and her husband Rob had 3 kids in Catholic school and a mortgage of their own. "You're the one who's in a position to do something, and honestly, I think it would mean a lot to Mom and Dad if their kids did this for them." Their kids, as if this were a collective undertaking with equal distribution. I noticed that. I filed it away without quite knowing why. My father called last of the 3, which I think was deliberate. He was always the one who came last, who said the fewest words, who wielded his scarcity strategically without ever seeming manipulative. He just said, "I wanted to tell you that whatever you decide is fine. We'll figure something out." He paused. "I just wanted to say that I'm proud of you, for what you've built. I always have been." My father telling me he was proud of me was not a common occurrence. We were not a family of easy emotional declarations. Hearing him say it felt significant in a way I couldn't entirely process in the moment. 3 weeks after Ellen's initial call, I told my mother I was considering it. Looking back, I can see the mechanism clearly now. I couldn't see it then. Or I could see parts of it. I noticed the coordination, the sequencing of calls, the way each family member came with their piece of the argument, but I interpreted that coordination as genuine collective concern. I didn't consider that it might have been something else. And the week's tea. Hat followed, I started making lists. That was my way. Lists of pros and cons, lists of financial projections, lists of what the house might sell for, and what I could expect in terms of equity after the real estate agent's commission and closing costs. I talked to a financial advisor named Patricia who worked out of a small office near my workplace. She listened carefully and then said, very straightforwardly, "You're describing giving away your primary financial asset to help your family. That's not necessarily a bad decision, but you need to understand that it's not an investment. It's a gift. Make sure you're treating it like one." I heard her, I acknowledged what she said, I thanked her for her time. And then I went home and continued making lists that were, now that I look at them, lists designed to rationalize a decision I had already emotionally made. The family logic had taken hold. The logic went like this: you have something, they need something, you are the one in position to give it. Therefore, you give it. That logic is clean and it is simple, and it is the kind of logic that sounds like love and sometimes is love. The part it leaves out, the part that I would spend the next 2 years slowly uncovering, is the word therefore. That word does a lot of work. It skips over questions. Questions like, what will I have when this is done? What do the people asking me actually plan to do with what I give? What is the difference between what I am being told and what is actually true? I didn't ask those questions. I was the steady one, the one who planned ahead, the one who, apparently, had been planning ahead all this time for exactly this moment. I listed the house in late April. Section 3, the sell. It sold in 19 days. I had expected it to take longer. The market was warm, the house was priced reasonably, and the couple who bought it, a young woman named Jessica and her husband Mark, who was being relocated for work, came in with a strong offer after seeing it twice. They seemed genuinely happy about it. They walked through the rooms with the particular energy of people imagining their future, their voices echoing a little in the empty spaces because I had already begun packing. The closing was on a Thursday morning in June. I signed a great many documents at a long table in a real estate lawyer's office. There was a bowl of wrapped candies in the center of the table, the kind of soft butterscotch candies that appear in waiting rooms and at receptions, and I ate 3 of them without really intending to. The lawyer was efficient and pleasant and explained each document briefly before I signed it. I felt calm during the whole process in a way that seemed slightly unreal even at the time, the way people sometimes feel calm in moments that should feel large, because the largeness of the moment hasn't finished arriving yet. When it was over, I walked out to my car and sat there for a while. The street was ordinary. There was a delivery truck double-parked a block away. A woman was walking a small dog on a retractable leash, and the dog was investigating a fire hydrant with intense concentration. I watched all of this. After closing costs and the real estate commission, I had cleared $64,000. That money, combined with the savings I had, came to just under $90,000, which sounds like a lot of money, which is a lot of money. It is also, when you are 39 years old and have just sold the only property you owned, everything. I moved into my parents' house 2 weeks later. My old bedroom was still somewhat recognizably mine, the same closet, the same window overlooking the backyard, though my mother had used it as a sewing room for about a decade and had cleared it out partially but not completely. There were still cardboard boxes of fabric in the corner, soft bolts of material in muted colors. I stacked my own boxes against the wall and told myself this was temporary. 6 months, maybe 8. Long enough to help with the renovation, contribute to the costs, see my parents stabilized. I told myself a lot of things that summer. Section 4, what love looks like when it's real. The first month was actually good. I say that honestly, without revision. My mother cooked dinner most nights and my father and I watched baseball together in the evenings, which we had not done since I was a teenager, and there was something genuinely restorative about it. The slowness of the house. The familiarity of the sounds it made, the way the refrigerator hummed at a particular pitch, the particular creak of the third stair from the bottom, the sound of the furnace cycling on in the morning. I had grown up with all of those sounds and I had forgotten them, and coming back to them was not unpleasant. I transferred $30,000 to my parents' joint account in July, as agreed. That money was earmarked for the roof and the furnace. My mother said, "We'll make sure Eve. $1 is accounted for," and I believed her. I had no reason not to. These were my parents. The roofer came in early August. He was a man named Gary who had been doing roofs in Columbus for 20 years and came with several recommendations. He assessed the damage, gave a quote of $14,000, and the work was scheduled for mid-August. I was at work when the work was done, but my mother sent me a photo of the new shingles when it was finished, and I felt something that was genuinely close to satisfaction. Something had been repaired. Something real had been fixed. The furnace evaluation came next. The technician, a quiet man named Harold, spent about an hour in the basement and then came upstairs and said the unit wasn't in as bad shape as the previous assessment had suggested. It needed servicing and some parts, maybe $1,200 of work, but it wasn't at end of life yet. He thought it had several more winters in it with proper maintenance. I was relieved. That was $16,000, more or less, out of the $30,000 I had contributed, and there was still money left. Some of the remaining money went to the bathroom remodel, new tile, new fixtures. A contractor Ellen had found who charged $11,000 for the work. So there it was, $30,000 spent, work done. The house materially improved. I remember one evening sitting in the living room with my parents while the evening news played quietly on the television, and my father was in his chair and my mother was on the couch, and I thought, this is what I sold the house for. This stability. This quiet. This basic functional comfort for two people who are old enough that comfort has earned its importance. I believed that completely in that moment. I want you to know that, because what I discovered later did not invalidate the good that was real in those months. There was real good, real love, real dinners and real baseball games and real repair. What I discovered later was layered on top of all of that, like something hidden inside something beautiful, and the discovery didn't erase the beauty. It just complicated it in ways I'm still sitting with. Section 5, the first thing that didn't fit. It started with a number. In September, about 6 weeks after I moved in, my mother was in the kitchen paying bills at the kitchen table the way she always had, by hand, with a checkbook, envelopes laid out in a row. I walked through the kitchen to get a glass of water and glanced at the table, not intending to look at anything specific, just the casual glance you give to a familiar domestic scene, and I saw the number on the top check. It was made out to a company I didn't recognize for $640. I didn't say anything. I got my water and went back to the living room, but the number stayed with me, the way numbers do when you're the kind of person who has kept a green notebook tracking your expenses for years. $640 made out to a company whose name I didn't recognize wasn't necessarily anything. My parents had expenses I wasn't fully aware of. It wasn't my business. I let it go. 2 weeks later, I heard my mother on the phone in the dining room. The door was nearly closed and I wasn't trying to listen. I was walking down the hallway toward the bathroom, but I caught a fragment of the call. She was saying, "No, I told you we can take care of it. Yes. The money came through, so?" And then she lowered her voice in a way that people do when they become aware that sound carries. That fragment was nothing. A phone call. An assurance about money. In a house with 2 retired people on a fixed income, money was frequently the subject of conversation. I had no reason to read anything into it. And yet, I started noticing, without intending to, without deciding to, the small irregularities. Not big things, just small things that didn't quite fit the picture I'd been given. My mother buying a new chair for the living room in October. It was a nice chair, a cushioned recliner in a deep burgundy color, and when I mentioned it, she said something about how the old one had been uncomfortable for years and she'd been putting it off. Which was true. I had sat in the old chair. It had not been comfortable. But new recliners in that style ran between $400 and $800, and the money for the roof and the furnace and the bathroom had come from my contribution. Where was the chair money coming from? That was the question I didn't ask out loud. I put it in a private mental file with the $640 check and the lowered voice on the phone, and I went on with my days. In November, Kevin came to Sunday dinner with Amy and their 2 kids. Dinner at my parents' house was warm and loud in the way family dinners are: children asking for things, someone always getting up to refill something, competing conversations. Kevin was in good spirits. He and my father talked about the Browns for 20 minutes. Ellen and her family were there too, and the house felt full in the way it hadn't felt in years. After dinner, while the kids watched something on a tablet and the adults sat with coffee, Kevin mentioned something to my mother that he clearly intended me to hear. He said, "Amy and I are finally seeing some breathing room this month. It really helps." My mother said, "Good, good," in a way that seemed to close the subject rather than open it. But I had heard it. It really helps. Something was helping. Some source of money or relief was providing Kevin and Amy breathing room. I looked at my mother's face, and she was looking at her coffee cup, and I had that quiet, internal sensation of something not quite fitting, the mental equivalent of a door that won't close flush. You push it, and it closes, and then you notice the light still coming through at the bottom. I said nothing. The conversation moved on. But I didn't forget it. Section 6, asking questions in the wrong order. December arrived. I had been living in my parents' house for 5 months. I had adapted to the rhythms of the house more than I expected: the early dinners, the quieter evenings, the particular pace of retired people's days. I had been paying a small amount of monthly rent, $500, which was my suggestion, my way of contributing to the ongoing expenses without it feeling like pure charity in either direction. I was also buying groceries, maybe twice a week, and paying for things that came up: a plumber for a slow drain, a new part for the dishwasher. My own savings had come down from $90,000 to about $72,000, which was still a healthy number. But I was also 39 years old, not owning property, living in my childhood bedroom, and while I had told myself this arrangement was temporary, 5 months in it did not yet feel temporary. It felt like the shape my life had taken. I started in December asking questions. Still small questions, still framed carefully, still the kind of questions that could be mistaken for casual conversation. I asked my mother about the finances, not in a challenging way, just as someone who had contributed substantially and had a natural interest. She told me the roof and furnace and bathroom had been handled. The remaining money from my contribution, she said, was in a savings account for future repairs. "How much is left?" I asked. She gave me a number, something around $8,000. That number troubled me. The roof had been $14,000. The furnace worked $1,200. The bathroom $11,000. That was $26,200, which left $3,800 from the $30,000 I had contributed, not $8,000. I didn't say this out loud. I did the math in my head twice to make sure I wasn't wrong. I wasn't wrong. I said, "That sounds good," and changed the subject, and that night I lay in my old bedroom in the dark with the familiar sounds of the house around me, and I thought about the difference between $3,800 and $8,000. That $4,200 gap, which could have come from anything: incidentals, small repairs I didn't know about, some expense I wasn't accounting for. But it bothered me. I kept returning to it the way you keep returning to a room where you thought you left something, not sure what you left, just sure that something is missing. I want to be clear about what I was feeling then, because it wasn't suspicion exactly. It was more like unease. The specific unease of a person who has trusted deeply and is encountering, for the first time, the possibility that they trusted without complete information. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't anger. It was quiet, and it sat low in my chest, and I went to sleep eventually and got up the next morning and had breakfast with my parents, and nothing in the morning seemed any different from the morning before. But something had changed. I had started asking questions in my own head, and once you start, you find you cannot stop. Section 7. Learning to look. January was cold that year. Columbus cold, the kind that settles in flat and gray and stays for weeks without relief. I was working from home 2 days a week by then. My employer had shifted to a hybrid arrangement, and those home days gave me time I hadn't had before. Time in the house, in the quiet of a Tuesday or Wednesday morning, while my parents ran errands or visited friends or simply stayed in their rooms. I am not a person who goes through other people's things. I want to say that clearly because what I did in January doesn't reflect who I am or who I want to be. But I also want to be honest, because the truth of this story depends on honesty. On one of those quiet Tuesday mornings, while my parents were both out, I sat down at the kitchen table where my mother paid her bills, and I looked at the checkbook that she kept in the top left drawer beside the utensil tray. The checkbook she had always kept there, as long as I could remember. I didn't open it immediately. I sat there for probably 10 minutes, just being in the room, being with the decision. The furnace hummed. The refrigerator made its sound. Through the window, the backyard was gray and frozen, the 2 old oak trees at the back fence stripped bare. Then I opened the checkbook and read the last 3 months of register entries. The roof payment to Gary's Roofing was there. The furnace servicing was there. The contractor for the bathroom was there. And then there were other entries. Regular entries made monthly to 2 names I recognized, Kevin and Ellen. The amounts varied slightly month to month, but they averaged around $800 to Kevin and $600 to Ellen. Monthly, every month. Since July. I did the arithmetic sitting right there at the kitchen table. Since July, my parents had written Kevin approximately $4,000 and Ellen approximately $3,000. $7,000. Going out in regular monthly payments to my siblings. I sat with that for a long time. The furnace hummed. I sat with it until I heard my mother's car in the driveway, and I closed the checkbook and put it back and stood up and went to the sink and filled a glass of water and was standing at the counter drinking it when she came through the door, stomping the cold off her boots, carrying a bag from the grocery store, saying, "It is freezing out there." "It really is," I said. I drank my water, I said nothing else. My face was completely still. I was very good at completely still. Section 8. The space between knowing and understanding. There is a difference between knowing something and understanding it. Knowing is an event. Understanding is a process that takes time. I had learned something sitting at that kitchen table in January, but I would spend the next several weeks moving from having learned it toward actually understanding what it meant. What I knew, my parents were giving my money from my contribution, to Kevin and Ellen on a regular basis. Monthly payments that totaled, since July, somewhere around $7,000 between the 2 of them. What I didn't know, whether this had been discussed between my siblings before they asked me to help. Whether they had asked me to contribute specifically because they knew they would receive a share of what I gave. Whether the story I had been told, the failing roof, the stretched fixed income, the family in need, was the complete story or a partial one. And here is the thing about partial stories, they are often true as far as they go. The roof had been failing. My parents' income was stretched thin. My father's back did make the stairs difficult. None of that was invented. All of that was real. But something real can also be incomplete. Something true can also be strategically selected. A person can tell you true things while leaving out other true things. And the picture that results is accurate as a partial picture, while being deeply misleading as a complete one. I went to work, I came home, I had dinner with my parents. I watched baseball with my father. I helped my mother carry in groceries. I acted, in every external way, exactly as I had acted before. But inside, something was reorganizing itself. The way a room looks different after you've found something you hadn't expected in one of its drawers. The furniture is in the same place. The light comes through the same windows, but you see the room differently now because you know something about it that you didn't know before. I started paying attention to conversations differently. Not looking for confirmation of what I suspected, I was careful about that, careful not to let suspicion become a lens that distorted everything, but simply paying more attention, listening more carefully, noticing what was said and what was not said. I noticed that whenever Kevin called, he and my mother spoke with a warmth that was slightly different from the warmth she used with me. Not more love, necessarily, but more ease. Less care in the choosing of words. When Kevin called, my mother laughed more freely. When I called, or when we spoke in person, there was a quality of consideration in how she spoke to me, a slight carefulness that I had always interpreted as respect for my nature as the quieter, more serious one of her children. Now I wondered if the carefulness was something else. If it was the particular carefulness of someone managing a person they owe something to. I noticed that Ellen never asked how I was adjusting to being back home. She asked how Mom and Dad were. She asked if the repairs were holding up. She did not ask about me. I noticed that Kevin had not once, in 5 months of me living in my parents' house, offered to come help with anything. These were small observations. They might have meant nothing. NG, people have patterns of behavior that predate any given situation. My brother had always been somewhat self-focused. My sister had always prioritized the parental relationship. None of this was new. I could not build a case out of behavioral patterns I had observed over a lifetime. But I could remember what Kevin had said at Thanksgiving. It really helps. And I could sit with the knowledge that what it helped was being funded by what I had given. Section 9, the conversation I almost didn't have. In February, I did something I had never done before in my adult life. I called a therapist. Her name was Dr. Renata Wells, and I found her through my employer's assistance program. She had an office in a medical building near downtown, and I drove there on a Thursday evening in weather that was still cold but beginning to relent, the first hint of softness in the air that signals, tentatively, that winter is not permanent. I had not been in therapy before. I had been skeptical of it in the automatic way some people are not hostile, just unconvinced of the necessity. But I had found myself, over the preceding weeks, unable to think clearly about my situation. My thoughts about my family kept running in circles, returning to the same questions without arriving at answers, building in intensity without building in clarity. I needed somewhere to put them, someone to help me think. Dr. Wells was a small woman in her 50s with reading glasses she pushed up frequently and a way of listening that conveyed complete attention without judgment. I liked her immediately, which surprised me. I had expected to feel self-conscious. I told her everything. The house, the sale, the move, the checkbook. I talked for the better part of the first session, and she listened, interjecting occasionally with brief questions that were less clarifying than they were deepening questions that asked me to go further into things I had been describing from the surface. "When you saw the entries in the checkbook," she said at one point, "what was the first feeling you had?" I had to think about that. I had been so focused on the factual content of what I had found that I had not fully attended to the emotional response. I said, "I think it was grief." She didn't say anything, just waited. "Not anger," I said. "Not yet, just grief, like I had lost something I hadn't known I was relying on." "What did you lose?" I thought about it. "The story," I said finally. "I had a story about my family and what this was. And the story was wrong, or at least incomplete, and once I saw that I couldn't unsee it." She nodded. "Can you say more about the story?" "I thought I was helping," I said. "I thought this was a situation where I had something, and they needed something, and the right thing to do was to share it. I thought I was the one making a choice. But I'm wondering now if the choice was made for me, and I just enacted it." We talked about the difference between generosity and being maneuvered into generosity. About how those two things can look identical from the outside, the same act, the same money transferred, the same help rendered, and can feel identical even from the inside until they don't. About how families can construct situations, sometimes consciously and sometimes not, that make certain people feel that giving is the only available option. "Do you think they love you?" Dr. Wells asked near the end of the session. I said yes, immediately and without hesitation. "And can a person love you and also exploit you?" I sat with that for a long moment. "Yes," I said, "I think so. I think that's one of the harder things." I drove home in the dark. The streets were wet from an earlier rain and the streetlights laid down orange reflections on the pavement. I thought about what she had asked. I thought about love that is real and incomplete simultaneously. I thought about the roof, which was genuinely fixed, and the bathroom, which was genuinely improved, and my father's voice saying he was proud of me, which had meant something real. I thought about Kevin saying, "It really helps," and my mother lowering her voice on the phone. Real things and real things, layered over each other, none of them canceling the others out. Section 10, asking directly. I had spent 6 months not asking directly. 6 months of inference and observation and conversations in my own head and with Dr. Wells. 6 months of being the steady one, the quiet one, the one who does not make scenes or demands. In March, that changed. It started with a conversation with Ellen. She called on a Thursday evening, which was unusual, and the call had a particular tone from the opening, slightly elevated, slightly careful, that told me she had something to say and was uncertain how to say it. She asked how things were going. I said fine. She said Mom mentioned I seemed a little distant lately, and was I okay? I considered that for a moment. My mother had been monitoring my mood and reporting to Ellen. That was new information. "I'm okay," I said. "Are you sure? Because if something is bothering you." "Actually," I said, and here I felt something shift in me, a settling like something that had been suspended coming to rest. "There is something. I'd like to talk about it." Silence on the line. A brief silence, the kind that has content, the kind where a person is recalibrating. "Okay," she said. I told her what I had seen in the checkbook. I said it plainly, without accusation in my voice, just as a statement of observed fact. I told her I had noticed the regular payments to her and Kevin from my parents' account. I told her I had done the math and that those payments represented a significant portion of what I had contributed, and I asked her to help me understand. The silence that followed was longer than the first one. Ellen said carefully, "Mom and Dad have always helped us out sometimes." "With my money?" I asked. "With their money," she said. "That's their money, you gave it to them." And there it was, clean as a knife. You gave it to them. Once given, a gift belongs to the recipient. They can do with it what they like. The logic was, technically, correct. I had not attached conditions to the money. I had given it to my parents for their needs, and my parents, apparently, had determined that their children's needs fell within the scope of their needs. But there was something about the cleanness of that logic, the readiness of it, that told me Ellen had thought about this before, had anticipated this conversation or something like it, had her answer prepared. "Did you know," I asked, "when you called me last spring, that Mom and Dad were planning to share the money with you and Kevin?" Another pause. I knew that Mom and Dad help us sometimes. I didn't know the specifics. "But you knew there would be something in it for you." "Daniel," she said, and her voice changed, became slightly strained, "you're making this sound like we manipulated you. We were worried about Mom and Dad. That was real." "I know it was real," I said, "and I did know that. I also know that you and Kevin both benefited financially from me selling my house. I'd like to know if that was part of the plan from the beginning." She did not answer that question directly. She said that I was being hurtful and that she was sorry if things hadn't gone the way I expected. She said that families help each other. She said that I should talk to Mom. She said she had to go. We said goodbye. I held the phone for a while after the call ended. I had asked directly. I had not received a direct answer. But the shape of the answer I had received, the deflection, the readiness of the legal logic, the refusal to address the core question, was itself an answer of a kind. Section 11, the conversation with my mother. I asked my mother for a conversation the following Saturday morning. I used those words. I'd like to have a conversation. She knew what it was about. I could see in her face, when I said it at breakfast, that she knew. There was a brief stillness in her expression, not guilt, exactly, but awareness. The awareness of someone who has been expecting a door to open. We sat at the kitchen table. My father was in his chair in the living room with the television on a cooking show, the volume low. The weather outside had shifted, the first real warmth of approaching spring, sunlight actual and purposeful coming through the kitchen window. I remember the sunlight. I remember thinking it was strange to have this conversation in that light, in that warmth. I told my mother what I had seen. I told her about the checkbook, the entries, the amounts. I told her I had spoken to Ellen and about what Ellen had said. My mother listened with her hands folded on the table, looking at her hands, and she didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said, "I should have told you." Not, "You're wrong," not, "You're misunderstanding." She said I should have told you, which was a confirmation and an acknowledgement at once. "What should you have told me?" I asked. She looked up from her hands. "That we help your brother and sister sometimes, that when we have extra, we share it." She paused. "I didn't want to tell you beforehand because I thought you might say no." That landed quietly. She had known I might say no if I had known the full picture. Therefore, she had not given me the full picture. "Did Ellen and Kevin know?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Kevin knew that if you helped us, we'd be able to help them too. I told him that." "What about Ellen's?" "Ellen suspected. We talked generally about it." I sat with that. The family had known. Ellen had called me first, the opening move in a sequence. Kevin had called to add pressure. My father had told me he was proud of me. All of it coordinated, not necessarily maliciously, not as a calculated scheme, but as something families do. They organize around a goal, they deploy there to. They bring in the person who can solve the problem. I was the person who could solve the problem. "I gave up my house," I said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the plainest thing I could say. My mother's eyes filled, which I had expected, and I steeled myself against it in a way I am not entirely proud of, because I knew that her pain was real, and I also knew that her pain had, in the past, been something I responded to by making it stop. By fixing things. "I know," she said, "I know you did, and it's made such a difference here. Look at this house." I looked at the kitchen, the new faucet, the clean tile of the bathroom visible through the open door. I looked at the living room where my father sat, comfortable in his chair, warm in a house with a sound roof. "I know it made a difference," I said. "That's not the issue." "What is the issue?" she asked. "The issue is that I made a decision based on incomplete information. The issue is that I was told this was one thing and it was also another thing, and I deserved to know the whole picture." She said, "You're right," simply, without qualification. And then she said, "I'm sorry," which she meant. I could see she meant it. We sat there for a while in the morning light. My father's cooking show murmured from the living room. The refrigerator hummed its familiar note. Somewhere outside, a cardinal called, the sharp, insistent call of a male cardinal claiming something, territory or attention, something worth claiming. I thought about what Dr. Wells had asked me. Can a person love you and also exploit you? Yes, I believe the answer is yes. And I believe this is one of the places in human experience where language most consistently fails us, because we tend to speak of love and exploitation as if they exist on opposite ends of a spectrum, as if a person must be at one end or the other. But families are not spectrums. They are complicated systems. My mother loved me and had not given me the complete truth. Both of those things were happening in the same person, in the same kitchen, at the same kitchen table. I didn't know yet what to do with that. Section 12, KVIN. I talked to Kevin a week later, and that conversation was different from the one with Ellen and the one with my mother. Where Ellen had been careful and my mother had been sorrowful, Kevin was defensive. That defensiveness told me something important, that he was aware, on some level, that what had happened required defense. He said, "Look, Mom and Dad have been helping us for years. That's just how this family works. With their money, yes, I said. This was my money. You gave it to them, it's theirs. There was the logic again. You gave it to them. Kevin, I said, did you know, when you called me last spring, that you were going to receive money from what I contributed? He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment I could hear him deciding something, deciding what version of this conversation he was going to have. He said, Mom had mentioned she wanted to help us out. Yeah. So when you called me and told me it would mean a lot to Mom and Dad if their kids did this for them, you meant financially. That's not fair, he said. I'm not asking whether it's fair, I said. I'm asking whether it's accurate. Another silence. I was worried about them, he said, and his voice lost some of its edge and something more real came through. I was genuinely worried. The roof was a real problem. Everything I said was true. And it was also convenient, I said. Maybe, he said quietly, maybe it was both. That maybe it was both. That was the most honest thing Kevin said in that conversation, and I held on to it because honesty, when it finally comes, deserves to be recognized. I'm not angry, I told him, which was not entirely true, but was more true than it would have been 2 months earlier. I need you to know that I know, and I need you to know that what I did cost me something real. Kevin said, I know. I'm not sure you do, I said, but I hope someday you will. We said goodbye. The call ended and I sat in my car. I had made the call in the parking lot of the grocery store, a choice I didn't fully understand until after, when I realized I had wanted to be somewhere I could leave when it was over. I drove home. The air was warmer. The trees were showing the first green of April, that tentative green that is more suggestion than statement. I drove through streets I had driven through my whole life, streets with names I knew by heart, and I thought about what I was driving toward and what I was driving away from. Section 13. What power reversal actually looks like. I want to stop here and address something because I know what this kind of story can sound like. I know the template it can fit into. The wronged person, the family who took advantage, the righteous revelation, the restoration of dignity through confrontation. And I want to be honest. That template is not what happened. Life is rarely that clean. The power I reclaimed in these conversations was not the power of having won something. It was the power of having stopped pretending. Of having said, out loud to the people involved, I know what happened. That's the only power that was available to me, and it was, in its own way, substantial. Because the alternative, and I had been doing the alternative for months, is a particular kind of living that requires you to know something and act as if you don't know it. To see a thing clearly and perform not seeing. That is exhausting in a way that doesn't announce itself, the way a slow leak exhausts a tire. Gradually, silently, until one day you realize you've been riding low for a long time. Saying I know out loud to Ellen, to my mother, to Kevin, let air back in. Not happiness necessarily, not resolution, but breath. The simple, essential function of breath. My father and I had a different conversation. We had it on a Saturday afternoon in late April, sitting in the backyard on 2 old lawn chairs that had been there since I was in high school. The yard was green, and the light was the particular soft gold of late afternoon, and my father was quiet for a long time before he said, I owe you an apology. I said, you told Mom and me both what was happening, I think, in your own way. He said, I let it happen. That's the same as doing it. Maybe, I said. He said, I was proud of you. I meant that. Everything I said, I meant. I believed him. We sat in the yard for a while. A neighbor was mowing 2 yards over. A plane crossed high above, a thin white line across the blue. My father reached over and patted my arm once, twice, without saying anything, and that gesture, brief, awkward, distinctly my father, held more than the words he'd said. He didn't unwind what had happened. No apology could do that, but he told me it was seen. He told me the person who made the sacrifice was real and visible and mattered. That was not nothing. That mattered. Section 14. The decision to stay and the decision to leave. By May, I had been living in my parents' house for nearly a year. I had gone from being the person who planned to stay 6 months to a person with no clear plan and no clear timeline, and I had to acknowledge, no house to go back to. I had $72,000 in savings. That was still real, still substantial. I had not spent recklessly. I had been careful as I was always careful. But I was also aware that in the current housing market, $72,000 was not what it had been when I had bought my first house. It was enough for a down payment. It was a start, but it was not the comfortable position I had been in before. I started looking at my situation not as a problem to be managed, but as a circumstance to be understood. What had happened to me, I began to see, was not purely a failure of my family's honesty. It was also a reflection of something in me, the way I had built my whole sense of stability around being useful, around being the one who could provide. The family had exploited that trait, but the trait had been there to exploit. Dr. Wells and I talked about this over several sessions. She asked me once, "What would you have done if your family had been completely honest with you from the beginning? If Ellen had called and said, 'We're thinking if you sold your house, the money could help Mom and Dad, and they could also share some of it with Kevin and me, would you be willing to do that?'" I sat with that for a long time. "I don't know," I said. "That's honest," she said. "Maybe I would have said yes," I said. "Maybe not. Maybe I would have found a way to help that didn't require selling my house. I don't know because I wasn't given the chance to find out." "Right," she said, "and that's the loss, not just the money, the agency." Agency, the ability to decide for yourself based on real information. That was what had been taken from me. Not my house, exactly. Not the money, exactly. My ability to make an informed choice. I couldn't get that back. What had happened, and no amount of confrontation or honesty or apology could unhappen it. The question now was what I chose to do with the circumstances as they actually were. I decided to stay in my parents' house until autumn. Not forever, not indefinitely, but for a specific, bounded period. I decided this for myself, not for them. I had things to figure out. I had an apartment to plan for, a new arrangement of my financial life to design. I needed time to do that carefully, the way I did everything carefully, and the low cost of living in my parents' house, while not emotionally simple, was financially sensible. I also stayed because I still loved them. That sounds strange, maybe, given everything. But it was true. The love hadn't gone anywhere. The betrayal, such as it was, existed inside the love rather than replacing it. I was angry and I was hurt, and I was also a person who had watched baseball with my father and had that Sunday dinner where the house was full and loud, and the children asked for things, and the evening went on. Those things were all true simultaneously. Section 15. New numbers and a green notebook. In June, I bought a new notebook. Green cover like the old one, because some habits are worth keeping. I sat at the kitchen table, not my parents' kitchen table, but a table at a coffee shop near my office, a small place with good light and a reliable Wi-Fi connection, and I started writing. Not a budget exactly, a reckoning. A clear, honest accounting of where I was and what I had and what I could build toward. $72,000 in savings. A salary of $61,000 a year, modest but stable. No property. No debt, which was a thing I had maintained through everything, through the divorce, through the sale, through the year in my parents' house. I had no debt. That was something. That mattered. I projected forward. If I rented a modest apartment in the Columbus area, my monthly housing cost would be somewhere between $1,100 and $1,300. My other expenses, food, transportation, utilities, miscellaneous, ran historically around $1,400 a month total. Call it $2,600 per month in total expenses. My take-home after taxes was roughly $3,800, $1,200 per month left over. If I was disciplined, and I was always disciplined, I could save between $9,000 and $11,000 per year. 7 years, 7 years of saving, and I'd be back where I'd been at 39, financially speaking, without a house but with the equity to buy one. I'd be 46. That felt like a long time. And it also felt like something I could see the end of, which was important. Knowing a thing is finite makes it possible to bear. I wrote all of this in the green notebook, in my own handwriting, in numbers I could see clearly because they were real and specific and mine. I had 1 cup of coffee, and then another, and outside the coffee shop window Columbus went on being Columbus, the ordinary morning of an ordinary Midwestern city. People going to work, someone walking a dog, a delivery truck blocking a lane, and the car behind it waiting with perfect ordinary patience. I thought about what I was building. Not the same as what I'd lost. You can't rebuild an identical version of a thing that's gone. But something. A new version of stability, a new version of careful and intentional, built on the same values, just in different circumstances. There's a word I kept coming back to in those weeks: recalibration. Not recovery exactly, which implies returning to a previous state. Recalibration, adjusting the instrument so it reads correctly given the new reality. The reality was different now. I was different now. I knew things about my family I hadn't known before, and that knowledge changed the map, and a changed map requires a recalibrated sense of where you are. I was not where I had thought I was. I was not lost, but I was somewhere new. Section 16. What Ellen said in July. Ellen called in mid-July, about 2 months after our March conversation. This call was different from that one. Her voice was softer, less guarded, and she opened it differently, she said. I've been thinking about our conversation in the spring. I've been thinking about it for a while. I told her I had too. She said, I think I was wrong to frame it the way I did. When you asked me directly and I said you gave it to them. That was a legal argument, not an honest one. I appreciated her saying that. I told her so. I didn't tell you the whole truth when I called you last year, she said. I knew there was more to it than I said. I convinced myself it was complicated, that Mom and Dad needed help and we needed help, and it was all true and none of it was dishonest. But I left things out on purpose. And you made a major decision based on incomplete information. That's not right. We talked for nearly an hour. It was the most honest conversation Ellen and I had ever had, I think, the most direct, the most willing to stay in the uncomfortable places rather than retreating to easier ground. She talked about her own financial stress in a way she never had with me, the particular shame of it, the way money problems in a marriage can become a secret that compounds itself. She talked about the relief she had felt when the situation with me had presented itself as a solution, and the way she had let that relief override the discomfort of what the solution actually required from me. I needed it to be simple, she said, so I let it be simple. I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. About what you were asking me to give up. Yes. I told her I understood. Not to let her off the hook, understanding is different from excusing, but because I genuinely did understand. The mechanism she was describing was human and recognizable. The way need creates its own logic, its own selective perception. I had my own version of that. The way I had needed to be helpful, needed to be the steady one, needed to believe that giving was uncomplicated. I had had my own failures of honesty with myself in the same situation. What are you going to do? She asked. Keep going, I said. Save some money, get my own place. Do you regret it? She asked. The whole thing. I sat with that question. Sometimes, I said, but regret isn't the only thing I feel about it. I feel a lot of things. Ellen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know this doesn't fix anything, but for what it's worth, and I know it might not be worth much, I'm glad you're my brother. I told her I was glad she was my sister. We said goodbye, and I sat for a while after, not in any particular state of feeling, but in something more like stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when two people have said difficult true things to each other and the air between them has changed. Not healed exactly. Changed, opened up. Section 17. The day I found an apartment. In August, I found an apartment. It was a 2-bedroom unit in a converted Victorian house about 2 miles from where I worked. The second bedroom I planned to use as an office, which felt like a luxury after a year of working from my childhood bedroom, which still had remnants of fabric bolts in the corner that my mother had never quite moved back. The apartment had tall windows, the original floors, a gas stove that would require some learning because I'd had electric for years, and a small porch off the back that overlooked a shared yard with 3 old rose bushes that had been there long enough to be essentially architectural. I signed the lease on a Thursday and drove to my parents' house and told them at dinner. My mother put down her fork. My father looked at the table for a moment and then looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, something between pride and sadness, the expression of a parent who recognizes an ending. "It's a good place," I told them, "not far." "You don't have to explain," my mother said. "I'm not explaining," I said. "I'm telling you there's a difference." She nodded, she understood. My father said, "Do you need help moving?" I said no, but thank you. He nodded, he looked at his plate, he picked up his fork. Dinner continued. The television was on somewhere in the house. The summer evening pressed against the windows, still light at 8 o'clock, the long evenings of August that feel almost unreasonable in their generosity. I looked at my parents at their table in their fixed kitchen in their repaired house, and I felt the full complication of the year. The love and the betrayal and the loss and the repair and the new green notebook and the apartment with the tall windows and the rose bushes that had been there long enough to be architectural. All of it. At once. Section 18, What I Know Now. I moved out on a Saturday in early September. I had very little to move. A year of living in a furnished house had stripped my possessions to their essentials. My car made 3 trips. A friend from work, Marcus, came to help with the heavy things. By afternoon it was done. The boxes in their new rooms. The gas stove understood. The light through the tall windows at a different angle than any light I had known in any place I had lived before. That evening I sat on the back porch with a glass of iced tea and looked at the rose bushes. They were still flowering at the end of their season, late roses, deep pink, the kind of deep pink that only happens in late summer when the summer has been long and warm enough. They weren't my rose bushes. I hadn't planted them. Someone had planted them decades before I arrived, and they had been growing here all along, long before I had any need for them. I thought about the house I had sold. I thought about Jessica and Mark, the couple who had bought it, and whether the tomato plants had been replanted, whether the garden had been kept. I hoped it had. I had no way to know. I thought about what the year had given me that I hadn't expected when I started it. Not the financial lesson, though that was real. Not the confrontations, though they had mattered. What I hadn't expected was clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes from seeing something you were not prepared to see. I had spent my whole adult life being the steady one, the planner, the person who could be relied upon, and there is value in that, real, genuine value. The world needs people who show up and follow through and do the quiet, consistent work of building something stable. I don't regret being that person. I wouldn't choose to be someone else. But I had confused being reliable with being available. I had confused planning for others with planning for myself. And somewhere in that confusion, I had allowed a story to be constructed around me that served other people's interests or than my own, and I had participated in its construction. And I had signed the documents at the long table and eaten the butterscotch candies and walked out to my car and sat there. What I know now, what the year gave me, at the cost of a house and a year and a quiet, sustained kind of grief, is the difference between those two things. Between reliability and availability. Between planning for others and planning for yourself. That difference matters. It is, I think, one of the more important things a person can learn. I also know this. Love and exploitation are not opposites. A person can be doing both at the same time. Your family can love you deeply and use you at the same time, not because they are monsters, but because they are human, and humans are capable of magnificent selflessness and quiet selfishness sometimes in the same gesture. Understanding this doesn't make the using okay, but it makes it possible to hold both truths, the love and the using, without having to choose which one to believe. I believe both. Section 19. Learning to say no as an ACT of love. In October, Kevin called me. He was in a rough patch. Amy and he had had a hard month, some unexpected expenses, and he was asking in a roundabout way if I might be able to help. He didn't say it directly at first. He circled it. He talked about how tough things were, about how the new house had been more expensive than expected, about the kids' activities, about how Amy's hours had been cut. I listened. I listened carefully and fully, the way I had always listened to family, because that hadn't changed. My capacity for attention, for genuine care, that was still intact. And then, when he arrived at the implicit request, when the space for me to say yes opened up, I said, "Kevin, I can't help financially right now. I'm rebuilding my own situation." The silence that followed was different from the silences earlier in the year. Those silences had been calculations, adjustments, the sound of people managing their responses. This silence was simpler, just the fact of the no landing. He said, "I understand." And that was it. The conversation continued. We talked about other things, about the fall, about the family, about my new apartment. We talked as brothers. The no had not ended the conversation. It had not ended the relationship. It had, if anything, cleared a path. There was no subtext to navigate once the thing beneath the surface had been named and addressed. I had said no as an act of love. No to the premise that my function in this family was to provide. No to the idea that my stability was available to be reorganized around other people's instability whenever they needed it. No to the ongoing story of Daniel as resource. Not no to Kevin, not no to the relationship. Just no to the particular transaction on the particular terms being offered. It was, I want to be clear, one of the most difficult things I had done in a long time. Not because I felt guilty. I had moved beyond guilt as my primary register for self-assessment with Dr. Wells's help, but because the habit was so old and so deep. The reflex to say yes, to be helpful, to make the discomfort stop. I had interrupted that reflex. I had felt it arrive, felt its full familiar pull, and I had let it pass through me without acting on it. That was not nothing, that was work. Section 20. Thanksgiving, 1 year later. Thanksgiving that year was at my parents' house, the same as every year. I drove over with 2 pies I had made myself, an apple and a pumpkin, because I had started baking in my new apartment, which had surprised me. The gas stove, it turned out, was excellent for baking. The whole family was there. Kevin and Amy and their kids, Ellen and Rob and their 3. My parents, older looking, but warm and present in the particular way people are when their house is full, and the smells from the kitchen are the right smells and the afternoon light is fading, and all the people who matter most are present. I walked in and my mother hugged me, and she held on a little longer than she usually did, and I let her. I put the pies on the counter. My father shook my hand and then pulled me in for a brief, stiff, entirely sincere embrace that lasted about 2 seconds and felt like about 2 years. Kevin said, "Those better not be store-bought." "I made them," I said. "When did you learn to bake?" "September." He grinned. Something easy was in it, something that hadn't been in his grin for a while. Ellen found me in the kitchen before dinner, while things were being carried to the table and the children were being corralled into chairs. She said, quietly, "Thank you for coming." I said, "Of course." She said, "I mean it." I knew she meant it. I could tell the difference by then. Dinner was loud and warm and too much food, and not enough room at the table, and the children asked for things, and the adults talked over each other, and my father told a story about the factory thaw. Tea I had heard before, and it was still funny in the places it was supposed to be funny. My mother put her hand on my arm twice during the meal, just briefly, just a touch. An acknowledgement. a form of apology that words couldn't carry as well. Afterward, while Kevin and Rob dealt with the dishes and Ellen organized the dessert situation, and my mother sat with the children and my father dozed in his chair, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard where the oak trees were bare, and the late November light was the thin, clear light of the last days before winter settles in. I stood there for a while, just standing, just being in that light, in that yard, in that family. Something had changed and something had not changed. The people were the same people, with all their complications, all their love, all their imperfections and self-interests and genuine, messy care for each other. The money was gone from where it had been and was rebuilding from somewhere new. The house I had owned was someone else's house now, with their furniture and their lives in its rooms. But I was here, present, awake in a way I hadn't been before, knowing what I knew, seeing what I could see, standing in the thin winter light. That was enough, not everything, but enough. Section 21, the last thing I want to say. I want to end by saying something that might be the hardest thing to say, which is that I don't know if I would change it. Not if I could. Not entirely. And that is not a sentence I say from a place of defeat or surrender or the particular twisted pride of someone who has made peace with being wronged. I say it from somewhere more complicated. The year I spent in my parents' house gave me something. The confrontations gave me something. The green notebook, the therapist, the apartment with the tall windows and the rose bushes that were already there when I arrived, all of it gave me something. It gave me the knowledge that I could be hurt and could survive it without becoming hard. That I could love people who had not entirely earned the love I gave them, and that this did not make me weak or naive. That I could give something precious and lose it, and still in the aftermath have a self. The self is not the house. The self is not the equity, the $30,000, the 6 years of packed lunches. The self is something else, something more durable, something that remains when all the things you've built are redistributed. I am the steady one, I always have been. But now I know what I'm being steady for. Not for the family, not for the story they needed me to play a role in, for myself. For the life I am building carefully, in a green notebook, in my own handwriting, in numbers that are real and specific and mine. I still call my mother on Sundays. I still watch baseball with my father when I'm there. I made the pies. Some things don't change, and some things change so completely that you can barely see back to what you were before them. And the work, the ongoing, quiet, daily work, is learning to hold both of those truths at once. To live in the changed world without abandoning the things that were always worth keeping. That is the only ending I have. Not a triumphant one, not a broken one, just the real one. The one where I am still here.